Stacked at the edge of the long supper table, Millicent Howe arranged the last of the hothouse roses with the precise economy of a woman who had done it 100 times without being thanked once. The Carrington ballroom blazed around her, 500 candles reflected in mirrors that ran floor to ceiling, silk gowns in every shade of champagne and rose, the orchestra tuning its strings with the particular self-importance of musicians who knew they were the best available. Debutantes circled the room in carefully rehearsed patterns. Mothers tracked eligible men with the focused attention of generals studying a map. Footmen moved like shadows along the walls, invisible by design. The Carrington Winter Ball was, by every measure that mattered to the people inside it, magnificent. And at the edge of all that magnificent calculation, counting the roses in the arrangement she had just rebuilt after Lady Carrington's head housekeeper declared the original too spare, was Millicent Howe. She wore the gray silk she had worn to the Pembury dinner 6 weeks prior. No one in this room had seen it then. No one in this room was looking at it now. She had unpicked the lace at the cuffs herself, replacing it with something slightly newer, and the effect was almost convincing. She was 23 years old, possessed of a competence so thoroughgoing it had become invisible, and she had been managing this household, and the 2 estates attached to it, for 11 months without a formal title, a salary above room and board, and without a single record of her name in any document of consequence. Nathaniel Ashford, Duke of Marlow, arrived at 20 minutes past 9. The room knew it before it saw him. The particular shift in attention, heads turning with practiced subtlety, fans opening, conversation recalibrating, moved through the ballroom like weather coming in. He was tall, dark-coated, his cravat impeccable, his expression arranged into something that was not quite indifference, but was close enough to it that most people kept their distance. He moved through the room as a man completing an obligation. He had come because Lord Carrington had requested his attendance, and it was the kind of request a duke could decline only by substituting something more important, and nothing that evening had been more important. He accepted a glass of champagne, and did not drink it. Millicent, reaching past the tuberose to correct the angle of the outermost bloom, did not look up. It was the Duke who looked first. Later, he could not have explained precisely what caught his attention. Not the gray dress, not the roses. Perhaps it was the quality of her stillness, the sense that she was the only person in the room doing something real. Everyone else was performing. She was working. He watched for 30 seconds, long enough to register the methodical efficiency of her hands, the faint notation she made in a small leather-bound book before closing it and setting it in her pocket, and the way she stepped back to assess the arrangement without seeking anyone's approval for her assessment. He looked at her the way a man looks at a mechanism he has not seen before and cannot immediately classify. Not with desire, with the precise attention of someone who has just located something they do not yet understand. Millicent picked up the small pair of shears, slipped them into her other pocket, and moved on to the next arrangement without having noticed him at all. The person being steadily overlooked in any fine room is very often the person keeping the room standing. She had kept this particular room standing for nearly a year. She understood, without sentimentality, that it would keep standing after she left as well, because she had built it that way on purpose. Millicent had come to the Carrington household through the particular mechanism that sent most women of her station to households not their own: necessity, presented without options and without ceremony. Her father, Thomas Howe, had been a clergyman of the scholarly variety, the kind who spent more time with manuscripts than with parish finances, and who, upon dying unexpectedly of a chest complaint in the January of 1815, left behind 3 daughters, a modest library of considerable value, and accounts that were almost entirely in arrears. He had, it emerged, borrowed against the living itself. The creditors arrived before the funeral meats were cold. Her 2 younger sisters had been taken in by a maternal aunt in Wiltshire, who had married well and was willing to do her Christian duty in small, carefully bounded portions. Millicent, at 22 and the eldest, was offered no such accommodation. She was, as her aunt explained with the gentle brutality of a woman delivering an unpleasant truth she had not caused and did not intend to remedy, too old to be absorbed into a household without being useful. A distant cousin of her father's, Mr. Gerald Carrington, had written to extend an arrangement, not employment precisely, a situation, She would assist Mrs. Carrington with the management of the household. She would have her board, and a small quarterly allowance. The letter was careful not to specify the allowance in figures. Millicent had packed her trunk, written a letter to each of her sisters, and arrived at Carrington House on a Tuesday morning in February, carrying a leather satchel that contained, among other things, her father's annotated copy of Burns' Ecclesiastical Law, which she had kept because it had his notes in the margins, and a small notebook in which she had already begun a list of questions to ask about the household accounts. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like welcome. The situation at Carrington House was considerably worse than the letter had suggested. The household accounts had not been properly reconciled in 14 months. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Aldous, was 63, competent in the ways of the previous generation, and had developed a system of record-keeping that was entirely opaque to anyone who had not been trained inside it over many years. The steward, Mr. Pratt, was conducting a quiet and systematic extraction of funds from the tenant rents through a series of fractionally adjusted figures that would have been invisible to anyone who was not willing to sit with the ledger books for 4 consecutive evenings and compare 3 years of entries line by line. Millicent sat with them for 4 consecutive evenings. On the 5th morning she went to Mr. Gerald Carrington and laid before him a single page of figures. 17 discrepancies. The smallest was 3 shillings and 4pence. The largest was £42 across 14 months. The total, adjusted for the compounding effect of interest charged to the estate on loans taken to cover what appeared to be shortfalls that were not, in fact, shortfalls, came to £312. She had written it in her clearest hand, and she had checked it twice. Gerald Carrington had looked at the page for a long moment. He was a man of 50, well-fed and accustomed to being the smartest person available in any given room. The calculation behind his eyes was visible to her, if not to himself. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked. "My father taught me to read a balance," she said. "I taught myself the rest." Mr. Pratt was dismissed without a reference the following week. Millicent did not ask who had replaced him, because she had already understood that she was the replacement. There was no formal title, no revised arrangement. Her quarterly allowance remained at the unspecified figure implied by the original letter, which turned out to be £8, unchanged from the day she arrived. She managed the household accounts, the correspondence with tenant farmers on both of the Carrington rural properties, the quarterly negotiations with the wool merchants who purchased the Shropshire estate's output, and the creditor agreements that Gerald Carrington signed without reading closely, because Millicent had summarized them on a separate sheet attached to the front, and he had found the summaries were always accurate, which meant he no longer needed to read the agreements themselves. She had, over 11 months, restructured 4 creditor agreements to reduce the interest burden. She had identified a tenant arrangement that had been incorrectly recorded for 6 years and quietly corrected it, recovering £140 annually, in margin the estate had not known it was losing. She had renegotiated the wool merchant contract with a firm out of Shrewsbury in terms that gave the estate a fixed price guarantee for the following 2 seasons, protecting against the market fluctuations that had damaged the previous year's return. None of this had her name on it. She had, on one occasion, come close to breaking. It was the Thursday evening in September when she found, in a drawer in Gerald Carrington's study, that she had needed to open in order to locate the Shropshire deed, a letter from a solicitor in London. The letter was addressed to Gerald Carrington. It referred to the estate management improvements of the previous 8 months and attributed them, in specific laudatory terms, to your excellent steward, whose arrangement of the creditor obligations reflects considerable experience. There had been no steward since Mr. Pratt's dismissal. The improvements had been hers. Gerald Carrington had written to the solicitor and described them as the work of a steward who did not exist. Millicent had stood in the study for perhaps 2 minutes, her hand flat against the surface of the desk. She pressed it there until she could feel the grain of the wood through her palm. Then she had closed the drawer, returned to the morning room, and picked up her list for the following day. She was not going to step aside for anyone, but she was also not going to become smaller than she was in protest at a world that preferred her invisible. The accounts were good because she was good at accounts. That was a fact independent of who received the credit. The recognition she had been waiting for had not come yet. It came, in its beginning, through a closed door. Nathaniel, Duke of Marlow, had attended the Carrington Winter Ball for reasons that were, in his private understanding, layered. The public reason was Lord Carrington's friendship with his late father, which created a social obligation he honored at one event per year. The private reason, the one he had not articulated to anyone, was that his solicitor in London, a careful man named Mr. Edward Pemberton, had written to him 3 weeks prior with a report he had commissioned. The report concerned the Carrington estate management. Nathaniel's estate in Northumberland was in a condition that would have made his father grieve. Not ruinous, not yet. But the accounts for the past 4 years reflected a slow and steady erosion that his estate manager, a competent but conventional man named Sutton, could diagnose but had not been able to arrest. 2 tenant farms had reverted. A wool processing arrangement with a mill in Alnwick had collapsed the previous spring. The household staff had turned over 3 times in 18 months. The estate needed not just good management but a structural rethinking of its financial arrangements, and Nathaniel had found himself, at 31, with a dukedom that was technically solvent and practically hemorrhaging, and no obvious solution. He had asked Pemberton to investigate which estates in the region had shown measurable improvement in the past 12 months, and what had produced it. Pemberton's report was thorough. It described the Carrington estate's recovery in specific terms: 4 restructured creditor agreements, a tenant reconciliation that had recovered £140 annually, a wool merchant contract renegotiated for fixed price protection. It attributed these improvements to the estate's management arrangements. It did not, because Pemberton had been unable to determine it with certainty, name the person responsible. It noted only that the improvements appeared to originate from within the household, rather than from any outside advisor, and that the speed and consistency of the restructuring suggested someone with unusual practical facility. Nathaniel had read the report twice. Then he had accepted Lord Carrington's invitation to the winter ball. He arrived with a question already formed. He did not find his answer in the ballroom. The evening proceeded as these evenings proceeded. Introductions he did not require. Conversations he completed with the efficiency of a man who had long since stopped enjoying them, and a persistent background awareness of Lady Vivian Forsyth, who was beautiful and well-credentialed, and who had been positioned by her mother in his vicinity, with the particular subtlety of a military maneuver conducted by someone who believed the maneuver was subtle. Lady Vivian was 20, accomplished on the pianoforte, and entirely certain that the evening would resolve in her favor. She delivered her certainty with grace, which Nathaniel respected, even as he found it irrelevant to his actual requirements. He was in the corridor outside the ballroom, retrieving his thoughts in the way a man retrieves them when a social evening has gone on for long enough, when he heard it. A piano, not the orchestra in the ballroom. The ballroom orchestra was playing a reel, bright and mechanical. This was something else, something from a room down the corridor, played with the door not quite shut, and the piece was one he had not heard in 14 years. His mother had played it. He could not have said the composer. He could have said the exact quality of the sound she made on the 3rd repetition of the opening phrase, a slight ritardando that she did not apply in the first 2 repetitions, as though the melody needed to be tested before it could be slowed. The playing coming through the half-open door had the same quality, not the same technique, not the same hands, but the same understanding of the phrase. He stopped walking. The playing lasted perhaps 4 more minutes. It ended without flourish, the final chord allowed simply to decay. Then silence. He stood in the corridor for another minute. Then, because he was not a man who permitted himself to behave theatrically, he continued down the corridor and did not push the door open. But he noted which room it was. The morning room. 2nd door on the left past the portrait of Gerald Carrington's grandfather. He returned the following evening on a pretext about correspondence with Lord Carrington, which was not entirely a fabrication. There were matters to discuss. He spent 40 minutes with Gerald Carrington in the study, and another 20 establishing that whatever improvements the estate had undergone could not be attributed to Gerald Carrington's own oversight, which became clear when Gerald referred to the wool merchant contract as the arrangement Sutton put in place, and Sutton was employed in Northumberland, not Shropshire. Gerald Carrington had not noticed the error. Nathaniel had filed it. He walked the corridor again at 9:30 in the evening. The morning room door was ajar. The same piano, a different piece, played with the same quality of private attention. The kind of playing that is not a performance but a conversation the player is having with the instrument alone. He stood in the corridor outside the door and listened until the piece concluded. He did not go in. He came back the third evening. On the third evening, the piece stopped in the middle of a phrase. A pause. Then, without turning from the piano, a voice said, "If you have business in the morning room, Your Grace, you are welcome to come in. If you simply prefer the corridor, I can finish another night." He pushed open the door. She was exactly as she had been at the arrangement of roses. Contained, precise, her attention fully occupied by the thing in front of her. She sat at the piano as though she were at a desk, her posture entirely correct without being rigid. She had not turned around. The small leather notebook was open on the piano's music rest, which was, he noted, a detail worth recording. "You knew I was there," he said. "The third time a person stops outside a door," Millicent said, "it seems reasonable to address the situation directly." She turned on the piano bench and looked at him. "You have been to this house twice this week. Lord Carrington did not mention expected guests." "He doesn't know I was here the second time," Nathaniel said. She considered this with neither alarm nor particular interest. "Then what are you looking for?" "The person who renegotiated the Shrewsbury wool contract," he said. She had learned not to show things she felt strongly. What she felt, in that moment, was something she could not quite name. Not hope, because hope was a thing she had disciplined out of her daily operating assumptions. Something older and quieter, the particular recognition of a person who has been doing real work in the dark and has heard, for the first time, a genuine question asked about it. "That would be me," she said. He said, "I know," and drew up the chair nearest to him and sat down, which was not the response she had anticipated, and they spoke for an hour about estate accounts. She had managed worse situations than this one. 3 weeks after that conversation, a letter arrived from a solicitor named Mr. Edward Pemberton, addressed in formal terms to Miss Millicent Howe, inviting her to consider an arrangement at the Marlowe estate in Northumberland as estate consulting advisor for a period of 6 months, with a formal salary specified in pounds per quarter that was so considerably in excess of the £8 she received from Gerald Carrington that she read the figure 3 times before she was satisfied she had read it correctly. The letter was precise, professional, and contained not a single word that could be characterized as personal. The figure was £250 per annum. She had sat with the letter for 2 hours before she wrote her reply. Gerald Carrington had received the news of her departure with the particular expression of a man discovering that the mechanism he had never properly inspected was more essential than he had understood. He said she was, of course, entirely free to pursue any arrangement she felt was suitable. He said it twice, which told her he was calculating the difficulty of replacing her. She had, before informing him, prepared a full handover document, every account, every creditor arrangement, every tenant negotiation in current progress, annotated in the same clear hand she used for everything, with the relevant correspondence attached. She set it on his desk the morning before she left. She did not tell him that she had been waiting for this moment since the Thursday in September, when she found the letter that attributed her work to a steward who did not exist. She rose before dawn. She had one trunk and the leather satchel. She walked to the carriage herself, because she had not asked for a footman and she did not need one. Marlowe House, Northumberland, received her on a Tuesday in January. The housekeeper, a compact, honest-faced woman of 50, named Mrs. Laura Fenton, met her at the servants' entrance, which was where Millicent had requested to be received, not from false modesty, but because she intended to understand the household from its actual operational center outward. Mrs. Fenton had shaken her hand without ceremony and said, "The accounts are in the East Room, and they're in a state. I'll have them brought to you." The warmth in it was specific and unperformed, the welcome of a woman who had been managing without adequate support, and had just heard that something useful was arriving. She had the accounts in the East Room before noon. The situation at Marlowe was more complex than the Carrington estate, and considerably more interesting. There were 3 properties to reconcile: the main estate in Northumberland, a secondary holding in Derbyshire that had been mismanaged for years, and a Scottish property attached to the title through an entail that produced almost nothing and cost a considerable amount to maintain. The accounts showed the slow erosion Nathaniel had described, not dramatic collapse but the kind of steady structural loss that looks small in any given year and catastrophic across 5. The tenant arrangements on the Northumberland estate were in better condition than she had expected, which told her that someone with genuine local knowledge had been attending to them, and when she asked Mrs. Fenton, she learned that the groundskeeper, a Mr. Scott Hewitt, had been managing the tenant relationships on his own initiative for 3 years, because there was no one else. She found Scott Hewitt on the second morning, repairing a fence line in the northwest field, and told him that she had read his records, that they were excellent, and that she intended to build the formal tenant management system around what he had established, rather than replacing it with something theoretically superior. He had looked at her with the flat, measuring expression of a man who has been told things by people from houses before, and had subsequently watched those things not happen. She had handed him a copy of the proposed tenant register she had drafted the previous evening, and asked him to read it and tell her what she had missed. He had sent corrections back to the East Room by the following morning. 3 of them were things she had not thought of. She incorporated them all. Mr. Edward Pemberton, the solicitor, arrived on the 4th day and was shown into the library where Millicent had established her working space among Nathaniel's books. He was 60, silver-haired, with the careful attention of a man who had spent his career watching other people underestimate things. He looked at her annotated copy of the Derbyshire accounts for 30 seconds before he said, "You found the arrears entry from 1812. It was not a question." "The 3rd week of November," she said. "It was recorded as an estate improvement expenditure." "It was not an improvement expenditure," Pemberton said. "No," she said. "It was a debt service through the estate that should have been recorded against the personal accounts. The figure compounds. The current cost to the estate is approximately £44 annually, carried for 4 years." Pemberton looked at her for a moment, with the particular expression of someone recalibrating quietly. "His Grace has retained you for 6 months, he said. "He has," she said. "I would suggest, Miss Howe," he said carefully, "that 6 months may prove a conservative estimate." Nathaniel moved through the estate during those early weeks, with the deliberate strategy of a man watching something he does not entirely understand. He had hired her because Pemberton's report indicated she was operationally extraordinary, and because she had confirmed it in an hour of conversation about wool contracts and creditor agreements. He had not expected what he found, which was that the house felt different with her in it, not transformed, recalibrated. Small things that had been slightly wrong for years were quietly corrected, not by instruction but by the simple operation of someone who noticed everything and responded to what she noticed. The first week, she renegotiated the coal supply arrangement with the Alnwick merchant in terms that reduced the quarterly cost by £11. She presented Nathaniel with the revised figures on a single annotated page, the same format she had used in the Carrington house, and he read the whole page before speaking, which she had not expected. "You've kept the same merchant," he observed. "He knows the house," she said. "Changing suppliers costs institutional knowledge. The margin improvement wasn't large enough to justify replacement." He had looked at her with the measuring attention she was beginning to recognize, not the assessment of a man deciding whether to approve, but the genuine attention of someone finding the answer to a question they had not fully articulated yet. He had nodded once and set the page on the desk. He had not said "well done." He had not said "thank you." He had asked her 2 specific questions about the pricing structure of the alternative merchants she had evaluated, and how she had weighted the switching costs. She answered both questions precisely. Then he said he had business in the Derbyshire accounts, and asked if she had finished her initial review. "I have some preliminary observations," she said. "I can have them ready by Thursday." "I'd like to see them Wednesday," he said. She brought them Wednesday. The opposition assembled, as it does, from 3 directions at once. Lady Vivian Forsyth arrived with her mother at Marlow House on the 15th of February, claiming a social visit of the sort that the county considered ordinary, but that Millicent, reading the household's social calendar, understood to be the first organized move in a campaign that had been planned before Christmas. Lady Vivienne was everything she had appeared to be in the ballroom: beautiful, gracious, precisely formed by the machinery of her class to be the correct wife for a man of Nathaniel's station. She played the piano in the drawing room that afternoon with technical accomplishment and the slight self-consciousness of someone who knows they are being observed and has adjusted their performance accordingly. Millicent heard it from the East Room, 2 corridors away, and made no observation about it to anyone. Lady Vivian's mother, Mrs. Forsyth, came to the East Room on the second day of the visit, having first established that Nathaniel was occupied elsewhere. She was a woman of 50, well-dressed, who delivered social wounds with the precision of someone who had spent 30 years perfecting the angle. She stood in the doorway and looked at the account books stacked on the library table, with the expression of someone who has found, in a place they expected to be empty, something inconvenient. "Miss Howe," she said, "Gerald Carrington mentioned you when we last met. He spoke of your assistance with certain arrangements." "I expect he did," Millicent said. "This is rather an unusual position for a woman of—" Mrs. Forsyth paused, selecting her word with care, "limited circumstances." "It is an unusual position," Millicent agreed. She set her pen down with the particular deliberateness of a woman who is going to finish a sentence before she is interrupted. "I've restructured 2 creditor agreements this week. The estate will recover £38 annually. Would you like to see the figures?" Mrs. Forsyth would not like to see the figures. "His Grace's circumstances," Mrs. Forsyth said, "require a particular kind of companionship in this house. Something the county understands." "I am employed here as a state consulting advisor," Millicent said. "The county's understanding of that arrangement is not among my current accountabilities." Mrs. Forsyth left. Millicent picked up her pen and returned to the page she had been on. She did not feel triumph. She felt, with a clarity she found useful, that the conversation had happened and was now behind her, and the accounts were still in front of her, and the accounts needed to be finished. The second layer of opposition was, in its way, more substantial. Lord Francis Ashford, Nathaniel's uncle and the senior member of the family in residence for the spring quarter, arrived in March with the calm authority of a man who considered himself the guardian of the dukedom's long-term interests, and who had, Pemberton had quietly mentioned, been managing those interests with a conservative caution that was indistinguishable from inertia. He was 64, courteous, and entirely capable of looking directly at Millicent and seeing through her to the wall behind. He met with Nathaniel in the library on the second evening of his arrival. Millicent was in the East Room, 2 corridors away, with the door slightly open, and she was not making any effort to overhear, but the library door was also not closed, and Lord Francis's voice was the carrying voice of a man accustomed to making himself heard in large rooms. "This arrangement," Lord Francis said, "creates a structural problem. The question of your marriage is not merely personal, Nathaniel. The dukedom requires— The dukedom's accounts are in better condition than they have been in 6 years, Nathaniel said. His voice was quieter, which in Millicent's observation meant he was being more deliberate, not less. "That is not the point." "The accounts are not the point," Nathaniel agreed. "But they are the outcome of what is, and what is currently, is that this estate is being managed with a competence I have not had available to me since my father died, and I am not going to dismantle that because the county finds the arrangement unfamiliar." Millicent pressed one hand briefly against the wall beside the East Room door, and then released it. She picked up her list for the following day and continued. Lord Francis would remain the structural opposition for the next 6 weeks. He was not cruel. He was, in his way, operating from principles he genuinely held, that a dukedom had obligations to its class and its social position that superseded personal preference, and that a woman of Millicent's background, however capable, represented a disruption to something he considered structural. He was not wrong that the disruption was real. He was wrong about whether it was the kind of disruption worth resisting. The institutional circle, which is to say the collective social architecture of the county, operated more diffusely. It made itself known through the quality of silence in certain rooms, through the position Millicent was given at table when the county dined at Marlow, not quite below the salt, but not where she would have been placed if her situation had been unambiguous. Through the way certain invitations arrived for the household that specified the Duke's attendance and contained no secondary reference to Miss Howe, through the whisper campaign that she heard about only indirectly, from Mrs. Fenton, who reported it without editorializing and who had clearly decided that editorializing was not required. Millicent had managed Gerald Carrington's social complexity for 11 months without a title. She could manage this. The private scenes were another matter. They accumulated without announcement, in the way that things do when two people spend considerable time in the same house, and both of them are paying very close attention. The library was where it began properly. Nathaniel had a habit of reading in the late evenings. Millicent had learned this from the household pattern, from the fact that the fire in the library was always re-stoked at 9 o'clock, and that he rarely came to supper until after that hour. She was in the library at 10 one evening in February, because she needed the estate atlas to verify the Derbyshire boundary descriptions, and he was already there, in the chair nearest the fire, a book open in his lap and his coat removed, which was the first time she had seen him without the coat, and she registered it with the peripheral precision with which she registered everything. He was a man who wore his position like armor, and the armor had a specific garment, and without it he looked simply like a person who was cold and tired and trying to read. She found the atlas without disturbing him. She was leaving when he said, without looking up, the Derbyshire boundary description in that atlas was amended in 1808. There's a notation in the margin on page 47. The original survey had a 16-yard discrepancy on the eastern field. She stopped. She opened the atlas to page 47. The notation was exactly where he said it was. "Thank you," she said. "The 16 yards matters for the tenant lease on the eastern field," he said. "The current lease was written before the amendment. It's in favor of the tenant, not the estate." "I'll look at it tomorrow," she said. He nodded, still not looking up from his book. She left. She sat in the East Room for another hour, with the atlas and the tenant lease, and the amendment notation, and at the end of it, she had identified a renegotiation path that would correct the lease without dispossessing the tenant, which she considered the only acceptable outcome, and she wrote up the proposal in her notebook and set it at the top of the next morning's list. She had known, reviewing the Derbyshire tenant arrangements, that the Eastern Field lease was slightly irregular. She had not identified the specific source of the irregularity. He had been carrying the knowledge of the 16-yard discrepancy for, she did not know how long. Long enough to know which page of the atlas to cite without looking. He knew his estate. He simply did not know what to do about it. That was a different problem than the one she had assumed she was solving. The garden came in March, when the ground had begun to soften, and she had walked out in the early morning to assess the kitchen garden's winter damage for the quartermaster's supply planning. He came around the corner of the walled garden with the particular expression of a man who had expected to be alone and was not displeased to find he was not. He was without a hat, which was unlike him in public. She was in her oldest dress, which was unlike her in his presence, and she registered this before he could, which gave her approximately no advantage. "The south wall's mortar is degraded," she said, because she had been looking at it. "It's losing heat into the kitchen garden beds. The herb section is showing the cold damage more than it should." He looked at the south wall. "I know," he said. "The repair would cost approximately £6 and recover the equivalent in kitchen supply savings over 2 seasons," she said. "Do it," he said. They walked the kitchen garden perimeter together, without particular plan, because it was in front of them, and the morning was clear, and neither of them seemed ready to return indoors. She pointed out 3 other maintenance items she had noted. He confirmed each of them, and she understood from his confirmation that he had already seen them and had not had a mechanism for moving from knowledge to action. She was the mechanism. That was not a romantic insight, but it was, she thought, a true one. He stopped at the corner where the garden wall met the house foundation and looked at her. Not with the measuring attention this time, with something quieter. "You were playing the night I first came to the morning room," he said. "Not your usual pieces. Something older." She knew immediately what he meant. "I don't know who composed it. I found it in a notebook in the music room here. There was no attribution." "It was my mother's," he said. "She wrote it herself. I didn't know anyone else had learned it." The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a specific recognition, the kind that requires no completion. "I'll play it again if you'd like," she said. "Or I won't, if you'd prefer it kept." "Play it," he said. He looked at the wall again. "Get Hewitt to see to the mortar. He'll know the right approach." He walked back toward the house. She stood in the kitchen garden for another moment, the March light cold and clear, and something she had been holding very carefully for weeks shifted slightly in its position, like a stone that has been resting in one place for a long time and has finally moved an inch. The music room scene came in April. She had been playing the composition he had identified as his mother's, not performing it, working through it, because there were 2 bars in the middle section that she had been reading incorrectly, the timing slightly off. She heard him stop in the corridor and she continued without adjustment. He came in without knocking, which he had not done before, and sat in the chair to the left of the piano. She finished the middle section and stopped. "The 4th bar of the 2nd section," he said. "The left hand is holding the note 1 beat longer than you're playing it." She looked at him. "She used to do it the same way you are, at first," he said. Then she found the right weight for it. She played the bar again, extending the left-hand note. The room arranged itself differently around the sound. "Yes," he said simply. And then, because she was Millicent, and she noticed things, and she had been noticing this particular thing for 3 weeks, she turned on the bench and said, "Your cravat has been off-center since this morning. The left side is sitting lower than the right, by approximately an inch." He looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "It's been off-center since you left the house this morning," she said. "I noticed it at breakfast, and again at the Derbyshire meeting, and again now. It has been 11 hours. Why didn't you mention it this morning?" he said. "I didn't know then that it would persist for 11 hours, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Can you correct it?" She stood from the bench and crossed the room and reached up and made the adjustment with the precise, impersonal efficiency of someone who is performing a household correction and who is entirely aware that what her hands are doing is something other than entirely impersonal. He did not move. He was looking at a point slightly above her head. She stepped back. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," she said, and returned to the piano. It was not a love declaration. It was something older and more structural than a love declaration. It was the thing that comes before, the moment 2 people discover that the ordinary details of each other's appearance have become part of their operational awareness, and this discovery is more significant, in its quiet way, than anything that could be said about it. He did not say anything. He simply remained in the chair for another hour while she played. The council met in the 3rd week of April. Lord Francis Ashford had arranged it. He was too careful a man to call it what it was, a formal assessment of the Marlowe estate's management arrangements and the suitability of their continuation, but the structure of it made its purpose clear enough. The meeting was to be held in the estate library, with Nathaniel, Lord Francis, Mr. Pemberton, the land agent for the Northumberland property, and 2 additional family advisors who had been requested to attend from London. Millicent was informed of the meeting by Pemberton, privately, on the Tuesday before it was scheduled. Pemberton said, in the careful way he said most things, "You will be asked to account for the work you have done here. I thought it useful to give you some time to prepare." "What specifically will they want to see?" she said. "Evidence," Pemberton said. "Specific figures. Documentation. The family's concern is understandable, given the unusual nature of the arrangement. They will respond to facts." She had thought about it for the rest of the afternoon, and then she had spent the next 3 evenings preparing. Not a speech. She did not intend to make a speech. She prepared a set of documents, the original estate accounts as she had received them, annotated in her hand with the identified problems, the revised accounts as they stood in April, 4 months after her arrival, a reconciliation ledger showing every change, every recovered figure, every renegotiated arrangement, with the amount, the date, and the relevant correspondence attached. She prepared it in duplicate, because she had learned that duplicate copies were more persuasive than single copies. She bound it with the careful attention of someone who understood that physical presentation communicates competence before a word is read. She brought it to the library. The room contained 6 men. Lord Francis at the head of the table, Nathaniel at the side, his coat and cravat precisely in place, his expression the one she had learned to read as contained attention rather than indifference. The land agent, who had met her twice and treated her with a professional courtesy he did not extend to women as a matter of course, but seemed unable to withhold from her specifically. Two advisors from London who had not met her, and who registered her arrival with the blank assessment of men who had not expected what they were seeing. She set one copy of the reconciliation ledger in front of each man. "I have prepared a summary of the work completed on this estate in the past 4 months," she said. "I will answer questions on any item." Lord Francis looked at the document. He did not open it. "Miss Howe," he said, "the question before us is not specifically whether the accounts are in order. The question is whether this particular arrangement, is a suitable one for an estate of this standing." "I understand that is the question," Millicent said. She kept her voice level, the particular levelness of a woman who has been answering versions of this question for a year. "I thought the answer should be grounded in something specific, rather than general." One of the London advisors opened his copy. He turned to the reconciliation page. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You recovered £140 annually from a tenant arrangement that had been incorrectly recorded for 6 years. "Yes," she said. "In 4 months. 3, actually. I was working on the Derbyshire accounts in the first month." The other London advisor had opened his copy as well. The land agent was reading with the focused attention of someone recognizing work he had wanted done for years and had not known how to articulate. Lord Francis had not opened his. Nathaniel had not moved. "The Derbyshire arrears entry from 1812, said the first advisor. "This is listed as incorrectly categorized against the estate rather than the personal accounts." "It is," Millicent said. "The compounding cost to the estate over 4 years is approximately £44 annually. The relevant correspondence is attached as Appendix C." A pause moved through the room. The advisor turned to Appendix C. Lord Francis said, "The structural question." "My lord," said Pemberton, with the quiet authority of a man who has been in rooms like this for 40 years, "I would suggest reading the document before addressing the structural question." Lord Francis opened his copy. The room was not silent in the way a room is silent when nothing is happening. It was silent the way a room is silent when something is being understood. Millicent stood at the end of the table and did not move. It took 20 minutes. Not for the full document. 20 minutes for the reading of enough of it that the quality of the room changed. She could feel it the way a person who has been managing rooms for years can always feel the moment a room becomes something other than it was. Lord Francis reached the wool merchant contract page. He turned to Appendix B. He read something she had not anticipated he would read closely, because it was a secondary notation in her hand regarding a market comparison she had done to establish the fixed price guarantee's value. He set the document down. "You did this comparison yourself," he said. It was not a question. The market pricing survey. "I wrote to 4 wool merchants in Shrewsbury, and 2 in the north, for current pricing," she said. "The letters are in the file." Lord Francis looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel was watching Millicent. He had been watching her from the moment she set the documents on the table, with the particular quality of attention that had begun in a corridor outside a closed door, and had been accumulating in libraries and gardens and music rooms for 4 months. He stood. The room noted this. Lord Francis noted this with the stillness of a man recognizing a moment he cannot prevent. "Gentlemen," Nathaniel said, "Miss Howe has restructured 4 creditor agreements, recovered £217 in previously lost margin, and renegotiated 3 commercial contracts in 4 months. These are documented facts." He did not look away from Millicent. "The structural question my uncle has raised is a legitimate one. My answer to it is that I intend to marry Miss Howe, with her consent, which I have not yet obtained, and that the estate's affairs will benefit from the arrangement for a great many years." Lady Vivian's mother, who had not been in the room, would hear about this moment before the evening was over, and she would understand that it was finished, not because she was defeated, but because the room had seen something she could not replicate, not beauty or social credential, but the particular and irrefutable quality of someone who had put their actual work into other people's hands and asked them to look at it. The room did not erupt. There was a long moment. Then the first London advisor closed his copy of the document and said, in the tone of a man completing an assessment, "The accounts are in good order," and the land agent cleared his throat and said nothing, which was its own form of acknowledgement. Pemberton looked at his hands and permitted himself, very quietly, to smile. Millicent looked at Nathaniel with the particular stillness of a woman who has just had an extraordinarily large public statement made on her behalf, without consultation. "I believe," she said carefully, "that you have placed me in a position that requires some consideration." "I know," he said. He had crossed his arms, not in defensiveness, but in the manner of a man waiting. "I am aware I have not asked. I am aware that is backwards." "It is considerably backwards," she said. "You have announced a proposal before making it." "I intend to make it," he said, privately, "when you are ready." "I am going to need the rest of this meeting," she said, "and some time after, to finish my thoughts about it." "Take whatever time you need," he said. Lord Francis looked at both of them with an expression that had traveled some distance during the course of the past half hour. From the principled opposition of a man who genuinely believed he was protecting something, to the quieter expression of a man who has realized that what he was protecting may have needed protecting from his own assumptions. He said nothing, but that evening, when Millicent was alone in the East Room, there was a knock at the door, and Lord Francis came in, and stood near the door with the slightly awkward posture of a man who does not make a habit of private recalibrations. "The market comparison for the wool contract," he said. "You wrote to 6 merchants." "Yes," she said. "I wrote to 2, he said, in 1809, and was told the pricing was not favorable for a fixed price arrangement. I did not write to the northern merchants." A pause. "I may have drawn a conclusion from insufficient information." It was not an apology, it was not warmly delivered, it was the honest acknowledgement of a man who took accuracy seriously and had found an inaccuracy he was responsible for. For a man of Lord Francis's generation and position, Millicent understood, it was the closest thing to one. "I'll have Mrs. Fenton send tea," she said. He had left before the tea arrived, which was precisely what she had expected. He came to the morning room that evening. Not the music room, not the library, the morning room, which was where this had begun, in a corridor outside a half-open door. Millicent was at the window with her notebook, not writing, looking at the Northumberland dark beyond the glass. She had been thinking all day with the careful thoroughness she applied to every significant determination, and she had arrived, in the late afternoon, at a conclusion that was in fact not a surprise to her, which suggested it had been forming for considerably longer than the day. Nathaniel came in and stood near the piano. He did not sit. "I said I would ask properly," he said. "I am asking properly." She turned from the window. "Not because your management of this estate is indispensable," he said, "though it is. Not because the arrangement is convenient or the county's expectation creates a useful resolution. Not because my uncle will eventually accept the situation with less difficulty, if it is formalized." He stopped and looked at her directly, with the full attention she had come to understand was how he was when he was being entirely true. "Because when I stood outside a closed door for 3 evenings, I was not listening for the music. I was listening to understand what kind of person could play that piece with that particular quality of feeling and also keep the accounts in the order you keep them. And the answer was, that you are the same person doing both things. I have not met that before. I did not know I was looking for it." The room was quiet. Outside, the Northumberland night pressed against the glass. "I have not been entirely certain," she said, "that being seen was something I still expected." She was quiet for a moment. "I have decided that this is a sufficient reason." "Yes?" he said. "Yes," she said. He crossed the room and took her hand and held it with the careful deliberateness of a man who understands that a gesture, when there have been almost none, carries the weight of all the gestures that came before it. They were married in June, at the church in the village nearest the estate, in a ceremony that was small by the standards of the duchy and large by the standards of Millicent's expectations. Pemberton was there, Mrs. Fenton was there, in her Sunday dress, with an expression of unguarded satisfaction. Scott Hewitt attended, standing at the back, and left before the wedding breakfast. Lord Francis came and sat in the third row, and maintained the slightly formal expression of a man who has accepted something he initially resisted, and has found the acceptance, to his surprise, not entirely uncomfortable. The wedding breakfast was at Marlowe House, and Millicent had planned it herself, which meant it ran efficiently, and the food was excellent, and no one had to wait between courses. She had not been able to resist annotating the catering arrangements, which Nathaniel found on the morning of the wedding, and read in its entirety before setting it down and saying, with the quiet humor she had been learning to recognize in him, "Is there a contingency column?" "Third page," she said. He had looked at her for a moment, and she knew that what she saw in his face was the same thing she had felt in the morning room 3 months ago, when the piece of music had finally arranged itself correctly in the fourth bar of the second section. Their son, Thomas, arrived in the spring of 1818, named for her father. He was large and definite, and showed an early interest in the ledger books she kept in the East Room, which Mrs. Fenton considered alarming, and Nathaniel considered a favorable prognosis. Pemberton, who had become something between a professional advisor and a family figure of the most reliable kind, sent a letter on the occasion that was warmly professional in a way only Pemberton managed, congratulating them on the heir and noting that the Derbyshire accounts were in excellent order, and he expected to report similarly on the Scottish property by the following quarter. The Thomas succession secured the line, which meant that when Millicent's annotated estate management documents began circulating to neighboring estates in the following years, first informally, through Pemberton's network of property solicitors, then formally, when the estate management framework she had written out in full was adopted by 4 regional estates in the 3 years following, she pursued that project with the unencumbered attention of someone whose primary obligations were in good order. The annotated accounts, the framework for tenant register management, the merchant comparison methodology, none of them had her name on them when they began to circulate. By 1820 they did. On a Tuesday morning in October of that year, Millicent was in the East Room with the Shropshire correspondence, not the Carrington Estates Shropshire, but a holding of the Marlowe estate that had been poorly managed until she restructured its wool arrangements in 1817, when Thomas, 2.5 years old and recently escaped from the nursery, arrived at the East Room door in his nightshirt and wool socks, demanding in the specific and unreasonable way of small persons his age to be shown the numbers. She lifted him into the chair beside her and showed him the page. He pointed at a figure and said, with great confidence, "That one." "That one is 42, she said. 42, he repeated, pleased with himself. Nathaniel was in the doorway. She had known he was there, had heard his step in the corridor, recognized its particular quality. He was watching them with the kind of attention that had no strategy in it, and no measurement, just the private, unhurried attention of a man who has found what he was looking for, and keeps finding it, still, every morning. She did not turn. Thomas pointed at another figure. "That one," he said. "That one," she said, "is the one that tells us how much wool we sold this quarter. It is a very satisfactory number." Outside the East Room windows, the Northumberland October was clear and cold and entirely itself. The estate that had been hemorrhaging for 5 years was solvent and steady. The accounts were in order. The fire had been stoked that morning by Mrs. Fenton without being asked, because after 4 years she knew the East Room's requirements as well as Millicent did. Scott Hewitt was in the Northwest Field. Pemberton's quarterly letter was due Thursday. Nathaniel remained in the doorway without speaking, because the room was complete, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it, and Thomas was pointing at another figure. She showed him 47,